specifically trying to solve online education of these people. There is something called the gut-brain axis, which is that a lot of your thinking, a lot of your motivation, a lot of your mood, everything is controlled by a series of connections between your gut and your brain. It's not just your brain. The most obvious case of this is anyone who's experienced being hangry. Maybe you could develop like a microbiome pill that you could order online, like a learning supplement. And you take this thing, it engages your dopamine levels in the right way. It gives you the neurotransmitters and engages the development of those that you need to actually engage in learning. We know that the gut-brain axis is a thing. We have yet to conquer manipulating it, let alone manipulating it for very specific purposes. Between Singapore and Australia, for example, where Australians are very well educated in being told, we've taught you 6 tools. Now here's a problem, which tool are you going to use? Whereas people in Singapore are used to the question being framed as, here's a question and one of the tools that we've taught you, use that tool. If you don't tell them which tool to use to solve the job, they struggle a lot more. So they're good soldiers. If you tell them this is the problem and this is the solution. But if you just give them the problem, they kind of come back to you with this attitude of, okay, but how do you want it solved? Part of the reason I hired you is because I want you to figure out how to solve it, not just to be the robot that solves it the way that I want it done.
I've been thinking about bread because, have you heard of Buttercup? The bread brand in Australia. So
no.
It's like, I'm trying to reduce my carb intake. So 2 slices is, I think, 120 calories, which is pretty great for 2 slices of bread.
Yeah. That's
right?
20 calories below average.
I think it's like 220 generally, right? So it's like almost half typically what you would get 2 slices of bread for. It's slightly smaller, but sure, whatever. It's pretty good. So I went to the store, bought some. And then my wife was like, oh, Buttercup is so good. We should buy stock in Buttercup or something. And I'm like, okay. Obviously I'm not going to take that as financial advice, but I will go check it up. What is this company? Who's doing it? And I looked it up, and Buttercup is owned by this company called Goodman Fielder. However, they also own Helga's, Wonder, Country Life, Mighty Soft. And then I was like, okay, what about the other bread brands? Who are they owned by? And then Tip Top, Abbott's Bakery, Bergen, and Golden Bakery are all owned by GWF, another company. So every bread brand that I thought I had all this choice and this decision-making power, it was just 2 companies fighting my attention.
It's the same with drinks, right?
Yeah.
The drinks are all basically just owned by the company that owns Coca-Cola.
Yeah.
Yeah. And chocolate brands, the same.
It's interesting you say that, because if you look at the literature, so I've been reading this book called The 22 Immutable Laws of Marketing. Great book, by the way. It was written the year I was born. And so the fact that they said immutable, I'm stress testing whether it holds true 30 years later, right? And one of the laws, Law 8, Law of Duality, states that in any category, given enough time, it will always become a 2-horse race. It will become a duopoly. And I thought that was really interesting. And it's kind of held true in a lot of markets. 50, 60% of the market share will be owned by 2 different companies, and then there's a bunch of small players. But for the most part, it's number 1, number 2. And that's also with the consumer headspace as well. If I said, think of your favorite
Why
bread.
hasn't this happened with computing systems yet? You've got 3, right? Even if you just think about basic, you've got more than 3, but even it's Mac OS, Windows, and Linux.
Yeah, Linux is not in the race, bro. I don't know what you're
99% of servers run on Linux.
Yeah, that's servers. That's a different category. You're talking about server category, right? Then you think about consumer personal computing. I don't think they're going to be up there. It's going to be a duopoly between Mac OS and Windows, right?
Well, that's fair.
Yeah, and then servers, you prove my point there. Servers, Linux has a monopoly there. It's number 1, right? So,
but there are different distros, right? Ubuntu.
The point is,
the long tail.
Every category goes this way. The only way to win is to create your own category. And the other law that was stated here is the law of division, which states that categories always divide over time. They don't combine, they always divide. So you think about personal computing, it became laptops and desktops, and they start changing over time and they become new categories. So I've been thinking about this for our company, for entry level, because I'm not going to become number 1 in education. It's just not going to happen. I'm not even going to become number 1 in tech education. Not going to happen. I could become number 1 for tech education in Africa, right? I don't think someone's taken that spot yet. And so what I've been telling the team is like, all right, in a human's brain, on a consumer's brain, there is a top slot and a second slot, and then like none of the other slots matter. And so I want to be
everything else.
yeah, then everything else,
Yeah.
right? So I'm trying to figure out how to become either number one or number two in a consumer's mind when they think of insert category. So that was a really interesting rabbit hole I went down this week, and been rereading this book essentially to like think about it a bit more. But it all started with my trip to the supermarket, weirdly enough.
That's really interesting. I'm just wondering, like, I kind of agree with you. Like, you do see, like, even in gaming, it's like Xbox and PlayStation. And then you kind of have the PC platform, but arguably that's just one, right? It's just Windows, Steam. Like, that's kind of curious. Does the book give much motivation for why this happens?
Not explicitly. Like they give a lot of examples of like car companies and like Pepsi and Coca-Cola. They give all these sort of things. It's just, I think the way they explain it is that consumers just have limited shelf space in their brain, right? Like they associate, like if they think of a category or like an area, they associate with one or two brands and they don't really think about all of them, right?
So let me ask a kind of question then. Like on this point about bread, yes, it turns out that it's a duopoly, but as a consumer, it's not like you think it's a duopoly. To your point, right? Like you thought you had choice. You thought there was like 10 companies all competing that like, were all some equal market share. And it's only two behind the scenes.
So this is where it gets weird, right? Because then you start thinking, okay, there's different types of bread, right? There's different categories of bread where you're going to win different consumers, right? So there's going to be the just bread, sliced bread as a whole. That's a category. Then you have wholemeal bread. And then there's probably two brands that dominate the entire wholemeal bread space. Then there's probably like all grain bread, brioche. Like there's all these different categories. And I think if you went through every category, and I don't know this for a fact because I didn't spend that much time researching bread. I will if the audience wants me to, although I don't know how deep tech that is. I'm sure there's two companies leading each category, subcategory.
Yeah, I can definitely see the pattern. I think there would be a tendency though for people to like partition markets until there are just two, right? Like that's the other way that you can do it. You can say we're just going to break down our markets until there are only two major competitors, and we're going to call that a category. Because like to my criticism before about like computing, like to someone who's like deep in the computing space, it doesn't like to me as someone who works with computer systems. When I think about the category of operating systems, it doesn't feel like there's only two. It definitely feels like there's three. But maybe like just as someone who's super into computers, I notice the operating system that I'm dealing with everywhere. Like so. Do you call your phone a personal computing device? Well, if you're on iOS, fine, you call that the Apple operating system. But if you're on Android, that's Linux. And I would guess that the PlayStation runs on some variant of Linux, and I would guess that the Xbox runs on some variant of Windows. And so, like, you've got consumers are interacting with these operating systems outside of just a duopoly. But yeah, I'm sure that like a marketing person would come in and say, you can't market operating systems. You have to market products. You have to market experiences. And if you break it down like that, then you're going to have these, like this gaming that's a category, and there's like personal computing, and there's mobile computing, and there's whatever. Yeah, that's interesting though.
But I think the lesson to take away here for anyone that's listening is create your own category and become number one in it. Like that's a pretty surefire way to win. And
just get riches.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So I've really been thinking about this because I don't want to be the 50th education brand. Like it's just not going to happen. So I've really started getting the team to think about this. And so that's been really interesting. So we're like asking consumers. I actually put up a poll in a Slack group and I was like, all right, can you name the top 3 education companies? Like if you were to learn anything, like what are the 3 brands that come to mind? It's pretty fragmented, but for the most part, it's YouTube, Udemy, and Coursera. Like are the 3 that pop up. And I'm like, cool. I don't think I'm going to take any of those 3 down. So let me just figure out a new category.
Wow, those were not going to be the ones that had come to my head, but that's like, I don't know. Again, maybe reflective of the fragmentation. I mean, one thing to keep in mind though is that like this is a law of convergence. It's definitely not the case that all markets have two major players. It's that given enough time and enough maturity of the category, you will eventually converge to two players. There are definitely markets that are like, like who's winning AI right now? Like no one. I mean, okay, well, OpenAI is winning right now, but they're definitely not. There's definitely not a duopoly in place yet. It's all long tail.
Yeah, you're right. I should have added that. It's given enough time, this is what the pattern that emerges is. And I think the example they give is like car companies. When cars were first a thing, there was like 400 companies that spawned, and then it became like, a dozen or so. They all like died out. Same with cryptocurrencies. You saw this, like heaps of ICOs, most of them died, right? So you have this explosion, and then they sort of like peter out. Yeah,
I would say like part of why it's important though to give like rules and like reasons and motivations, like why does this happen, is that otherwise, again, you can just break down your markets until there's two, or you can also say, oh, well, this market hasn't converged yet. That's the only reason there's three or four. You're like, well, that's cheating. Like you need to be able to make a claim about the driving forces behind why this happens, because I don't actually think it's about consumers not having enough space in their head, because in the bread thing, it's like, yeah, there actually are, like, it feels like there are 20 types of bread, and it feels like there are 20 types of cereal, and it feels like there are 20 types of drink companies. There's probably only two that you can name off the top of your head. But actually, like, even then, I'm like, okay, Sprite, Pepsi, Coke, Fanta, like, there's definitely multiple that I know of as major brands. The fact that they all happen to be owned by either Pepsi or Coke is usually pitched to someone as almost like a fun fact, like a surprise, like, oh, you didn't know this. You didn't realize that you're actually only thinking about two companies, because you are thinking about like 10 different brands, and they could be different companies. So it's more, it must be more of a market forces dynamic than like a consumer headspace thing.
Well, counterpoint there, right? And this could just prove your point. I think it's more that if I said, name a sandwich bread brand, and then there's probably only two you could come up with, right? Like in Australia. And if I said, like, name a orange soda brand, there's probably only two that you could come up with. Like, my point is, like, the category is actually much smaller than you would think. And generally there's one or two given enough time. And I think bread and soda, those are brands where there has been heaps of time for those things to develop. However, you are right. Like, I could just be applying this model and like finding examples that work.
Yeah, orange soda feels like real, like that's feeling unfairly specific. I think I got one, like Fanta. That's the only one I got for you. Orange soda, like
Sunkist and Fanta, I think are probably the two that come to mind.
Oh yeah, forgot about Sunkist. Huh.
Yeah.
Who are the best podcast hosts? Obviously, it's just Loong and Ajay. That's it. There's no one else.
Well, I guess question to you is like, what's the category we're going to become number one in? Because podcasts are even harder because the shelf space in someone's brain is pretty low for podcasts. They can only listen to 3-4 podcasts like regularly. So we've got to fight for that like number one or number two slot in 1,000 or 10,000 people. I would like, 1,000 would be great. I'd be happy with that. So we're going to find that niche for ourselves.
It's someone asked me this question the other day, like, why are you doing this? And I realized, like, I'm just like, this is going to be a super, I don't know, like soppy answer, but like it forces me to hang out with you every week, and it forces me to read up on shit that I know that I would like to read up on. Like I like deep tech, and I would want to go and learn about things. Like in a future episode, we're going to do supersonic travel. Like I find supersonic travel cool, and I want to read up on it and know more about it, but without the like force factor of like, there's a podcast and I'm going to sit down and I've got a commitment to another person in front of me, that I don't just want to rock up and just talk out of my ass. It creates that need. And like before we were doing this, like we would like catch up once a quarter and be like, shit, man, it's been like, how did we let 3 months go by without talking, because we're both super busy founders. But then now I have to put up with you every fucking week. Like it's great.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's probably a similar motivation. Yeah, the forcing function to like research stuff is super helpful, because it's like going to the gym. Like you can go, but knowing that your PT is there waiting for you, and if you don't rock up, they're going to be like, what's going on? Yeah. You'd be like, okay, got to get this done.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay, so for today, I know you've prepped your stuff, but we're going to do that next week. This week, we're going to do something called Moonshots. Have you heard of this game before?
No, I haven't.
Okay. Do you know X by Google or by Alphabet, the company?
Yes.
Okay, so X is their R&D branch, essentially, that just researches hard problems to solve. They created a game called Moonshots. This was actually a while ago. I've used this with my team a lot, and I thought it could be fun for us to play the game. So essentially what's going to happen is they're going to give you a problem. They're going to give you 3 different types of technologies, and we have to brainstorm how we would use that technology to solve that problem. That's basically it.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah. And the goal is to create a 10x solution, not just a 10% improvement. So huge problem, breakthrough technology, radical solution that might sound impossible today, but could be possible in 5 to 10 years, which is exactly what this podcast is about. We can select, okay, so 10x, not 10%. Constraints breed creativity. I believe this is such a good statement. Like whenever you add constraints, it actually allows you to think about more solutions. When you have no constraints, it's very hard for you to think of stuff sometimes. You get paralyzed by little choices. Quantity over quality. So we're going to spit out as many bad ideas as possible. And then yes, and this is a very, improv style thing. Like when you do acting, it's always yes, and. All right. What are you thinking in terms of problems? Okay.
You got to go full surprise, yeah.
And let's do 20 minutes. Okay. So start the game.
Wait, so are we pumping through as many of these as we can in 20 minutes?
I mean, yeah.
Digital learning gap.
All right. So problem is globally, remote online learning remains out of reach for at least 500 million or 30% of school children. Okay. So a little bit outside of what we're doing. Mainly due to the lack of connectivity, equipment, or policies needed for learning at home. And the technologies are microbial fuel cells. Okay. All right. So drives electrical current by mimicking bacterial interactions found in nature. Batteries. I don't think that's anything different. And then microbial manipulation. Process of changing genetic material of all microbes, bacteria, fungi, etc., that live on and inside the human body. Go for it. You guys have any ideas?
Jeez. Okay. What was the problem? Digital learning gap. Can you go back?
So the accessibility of education for school children mainly. I'm guessing mainly in like emerging third world markets.
Okay. So are we specifically trying to solve education of these people, or specifically trying to solve online education of these people?
Online education, it seems. I guess education in general, but let's say online. Better constraint.
Well, even if I come with a shit idea, you have to yes and me. All right. So microbiome, there is something called the gut-brain axis, which is that a lot of your thinking, a lot of your motivation, a lot of your capacity to just generally think, your mood, everything is controlled by a series of connections between your gut and your brain. It's not just your brain. Anyone who's the most obvious case of this is anyone who's experienced being hangry. And so I don't know, maybe you could develop like a microbiome pill that you could order online, and like you take it as part of. I mean, people are actually trying to do this. Like, can you use a microbiome setting in your gut, almost like a nootropic, like a learning supplement? And you take this thing, it engages your dopamine levels in the right way. It gives you the what's the word? The neurotransmitters that you need to, and engages the development of those that you need to actually engage in learning. Like, I don't think we figured this out. We have we know that the gut-brain axis is a thing. We have yet to conquer manipulating it, let alone manipulating it for very specific purposes, like engaging, attention and focus, for example. But I can totally see that being a thing.
Yeah, I like it. Makes sense. Improve the education. I'm thinking in terms of batteries and fuel cells, it makes sense. Like one of the biggest issues we find, because we do a lot of education in Nigeria, Ghana, Kenya, like those sorts of markets, electricity always goes out. Like there's power outages all the time. And we have team members that are just working in the dark sometimes, or like just can't hop on calls because their internet's out or the electricity's out. That sucks. Generally, they have generators. I think if you had really efficient batteries, that would really solve the issue. The other thing is internet access. So a lot of the internet is really slow. What we've done, so we have a physical space in Abuja, Nigeria, and we have Starlink there. And they're able to get 250 megabits per second, which is to them, it's like insane. This is like the most insane thing they've ever seen. However, I only found this out recently. Our community manager there charges for Wi-Fi because some people already come in with their own internet connection. So it's very common for places to charge you like on top of the space rental for Wi-Fi, which is unheard of here. I can't imagine a co-working space being like, all right, you're going to pay extra for Wi-Fi, but very common there. I think batteries could make sense. And I don't understand how microbial fuel cells work. Bacterial entrant. Does that mean that you could have a battery in your body?
No, I think it means that you're using microbes to try and create batteries, right? Like your mitochondria, right, are essentially your body's batteries. So it's like, can you create bio batteries?
Okay, so hear me out. We're going to use the bacteria in human stomachs to become like a USB port, and you can just plug into your own stomach. So not only will your stomach power your body, but it'll also power your laptop.
I find that that's really I love that one actually. Yeah, can you just like plug an electric device into your body? For anyone who plays Warhammer 40,000, which should be everyone, they have these things called like las guns, which are like laser guns, and the idea is that they partly were developed over traditional bullet weaponry because you could take these charging packs and you could just heat them up on your body, just like being in proximity to you, and that would charge them. So yeah, let's do it. Oh, we have to pick a new tech card. What's this?
I guess so. We're going to pick one of these technologies. Which one would we go with out of all of these options?
Let's go microbial fuel cell because it's the least obvious to me.
Oh, right. Okay. We have to do the brainstorm once we pick one. All right. Well, that's not how I thought we played. Let's go to
Let's try again. Oh, man, we're playing this on hard mode, man. We're doing this one for each of them.
Yeah, I think that's better for content. Gives us more optionality. Are we going to surprise me again?
Of course.
All right. Surprise me. Start game. Okay. What do we have? Why? There's so many to pick from. It just keeps going education. It just knows from my search history. Okay, access to higher education. Between 2000 and 2014, the number of students enrolled in a higher education more than doubled, rising to 207 million. However, access remains far from equal. Only 8% of young adults from the poorest countries are enrolled, compared to 74% of the richest countries. Damn. Huge difference. Semiconductors, so materials that conduct electricity with superconductors, no resistance and can carry a current indefinitely without losing any energy. 3D printing, so the process of joining solidified material layer by layer under computer control to create a three-dimensional object. And natural language processing, so programming computers to process and analyze large amounts of natural language data.
I mean, that's a super obvious one, right? Which is translation of material. So there's a lot of really good, a lot of the higher education institutions in the US actually publish a lot of their material online. Like MIT has the open courseware system, for example. And I think that not only is there a language translation barrier there, that if you're, from a poor country, what are the odds that you speak like English to a high enough degree that you can actually interpret like highly technical English? But then I think there's also a way of consuming that kind of content that's been prepared and then saying, hey, natural language, AI, please deliver this to me in a like ground up fashion. Like, don't just like, hey, here's, the MIT courseware in quantum mechanics. Let's build up, talk to me, figure out where I'm at, and then create me a custom pathway to get from where I am to that sort of like understanding what's in that course. Give me the, requisite information that I might be missing, given my background. And, take this dense 12-week pack of material and deliver it to me in sizable, manageable, learnable chunks. I think that's, if people are not doing that already, they absolutely should be. And I think that is definitely going to be like something that happens in the future.
Yeah, I agree. I think that one makes sense. I want to try taking a stab at 3D printing. So I think 3D printing, where my mind goes to, is like one of the limitations for higher education, as I know very well, is the fact that access to laptops is pretty low. So when we were looking at market sizing for Nigeria, a very small percentage of Nigerians actually own a laptop to even do our course, which meant our TAM was limited from day one in terms of selling courses. So I was thinking you could 3D print laptops to make it a little bit more effective to get it out there. So if you had better manufacturing for laptops and getting computers out there, and you could just 3D print them, just like ship them out at mass, that could be really interesting. That's what I'm thinking.
You got to get a natural language AI to teach students in remote areas how to 3D print superconductors.
All three, I like it.
Checkmate.
All right, I guess you win the game. That's like
that's it. That's what I was in it for. I was in it for victory.
Yeah, I think superconductors also makes a lot of sense. We just talked about the electricity issue. So if you can get more wealthier countries to donate electricity, I'm sure there's excess electricity in areas across the world. And if you can figure out how to, we talked about this with the virtual power plants, right?
It's transport. Yeah, I mean, like transporting electricity over those kinds of distances is not that's not easy. I think superconductors are an interesting one in the sense that you just, if you can get it right, you can dramatically reduce energy infrastructure. And like one really interesting thing that I find about Africa, and you definitely know more about this than me, but a friend of mine, she was doing research for the WHO at some point, and I can't remember the exact stats, but there's this phenomenon that I think is called leapfrogging, where basically you've got these underdeveloped nations will leapfrog over shit technologies that developed nations are still trying to get rid of, right? So it's like copper wiring in Australia. Like the copper network is something that we have spent decades trying to convince the population to upgrade the infrastructure to fiber. And then Africa is probably just going to skip straight over both and go straight to like satellite internet. And eventually satellite internet is going to get to the stage where it's like super good and super fast. And they're just not going to have any of that legacy infrastructure. And or you look at countries like Singapore that have been built in the last 50 years, there's not a telephone wire to be seen, because they got to see all the other countries that built these telephone wires up front, and they were like, well, this looks dirty and hard to maintain, and they're everywhere. Let's just put them in the ground. Whereas if you're a country like Australia today, you're like, let's put all of our wires underground. That's a really expensive thing to do for basically no reason. So I could imagine superconducting being that kind of technology that once it gets developed, a lot of these countries that have bad electricity and energy infrastructure can just sort of like leapfrog over what by then will be shit solutions. Anyone not using superconductors will be like missing out. And the first world will actually struggle to make the migration in full.
Yeah, I think that's played out a couple of times. I think even if I think about like the internet in the Philippines, it's as fast as the internet here in Australia, which I thought like blew my mind because it took us so long to like transition from the old infrastructure to the new one. Even the new one's not amazing, but it took us so long to get there. But they leapfrogged directly to that, which is really cool. So yeah, I think we see this across Asia. It will probably happen in Africa. I think the biggest issue right now with the education side of things is that some of the base needs aren't met yet. So it's really hard for people to start thinking about higher education when they're like trying to get clean water, trying to get electricity, trying to get internet, food, like all these different things that they just need to survive. Well, maybe not internet, but once they get all those basic needs, then you give everyone internet access, and the playing field is a little bit more leveled. So I think
that's
those
actually
are
a
the
really
issues
interesting point. It's like this Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? Where I don't know, maybe you can use 3D printing technology to 3D print food. And if everyone doesn't have to worry about eating, then they can spend a little bit more time thinking about education, right? If they don't have to think about working to make sure that they can pay for food and basic resources. And this is just something that's very well understood. And you can actually even get to the top of this pyramid and live some crazy hedonistic lifestyle because you don't actually have to worry about survival. And we end up weirdly unsatisfied.
Yeah. I think also the 3D printing side, my mind goes to distributed manufacturing, which is the future, which I'd like to see happen, where you just, instead of ordering something and they ship it to you, you order something and you download the STL file and it just prints the thing for you, whether it be food, new mobile phone, whatever.
To keep that on the theme of like higher education, though, like I think it suddenly makes the potential for online education of different topics viable. Because today, like if you did online education as part of like higher education, you do like a university degree online, which is becoming increasingly popular, you're somewhat limited in the scope of things you can learn about. Like how much of an engineering degree can you do without actually building something, right? Like how much of a robotics course can you do without building a robot? There's only so much you can do online purely in software. And so I think being able to 3D print components that you need, like being able to 3D print lab materials for a science degree, being able to 3D print robots and robot parts for a robotics degree, it was kind of a joke, but like using 3D printing to 3D print parts for a superconductor, right? You can suddenly teach people electrical engineering in a way that you couldn't if it was purely online.
Yeah, I like that. I appreciate you tying it back in. I wasn't even thinking about that. My mind just went wherever it decided to go.
There are constraints, AJ. That was the point.
Yeah.
Yeah, let's return to setup.
All right, let's try something else.
I really like this. I'm gonna force my team to do this.
Yeah, I've done this with my team a few times. It's good. Yeah, I think these are good ideas. But I think we have time for one more round. What are you thinking?
Let's do it. Yeah.
All right.
Why not?
I'm curious to see what your team comes up with when you guys play this.
So I actually did, not this, but I did a session with my team, which was like, how are we going to make our product go viral? And it was like, we did like an hour on this and everyone got into pairs and like you had to come up with 20 ideas. And it was like, yeah, the same idea. Like, there are no bad ideas. And then we got everyone to present and we gave out sort of like meaningless prizes, which like people just voted on like what was the funniest one, what was the worst one, what was the best one. It was actually really fun and very useful. Like, so definitely some of those ideas that came up will end up in our product.
Nice. I'm going to use the award ceremony idea. That's good. I like that because it like creates some other like side goals, not just like, okay, come up with a great idea. It's like, oh, I can come up with a funny idea or the worst idea. Like I'll still get an award. That's interesting. All right. So access to financial services. 1.7 billion people do not have access to basic financial services, such as the ability to save for family needs, borrow to support a business, or build a cushion against an emergency. Having access to financial services is a critical step towards reducing poverty and inequality. So we have predictive analytics and modeling, the use of data, statistical algorithms, and ML techniques to identify the likelihood of future outcomes based on historical data. Programmable matter that has the ability to change its physical properties based on the user input or programming, and gasification, which we talked about in the previous round.
Well, I mean, predictive analytics and modeling is kind of a no-brainer, right? Like, I don't know if you've seen Autopilot, which is this automatic investment like app, and basically it's a layer on top of your broker. So brokers are the middleman through which you actually access financial services. But given that, you still have to decide what you want to do. So you have to still tell your broker, I want to buy this stock, I want to buy that stock. And I've definitely been through this with my friends where they ask me for financial advice and you say, okay, go do these sorts of things. And they go over to their broker and they're like, I have no idea what to invest in, right? And so like having accessible predictive models that are even just basic things, like sometimes they don't even need to be predictive and analytical. Like the stuff that's happening today is like portfolio mimicking. So you'll say, do whatever Warren Buffett's doing because he has to, publicly file all of his investments within some delay. So just invest in the same things, right? Proportionally, obviously, scaled down to your investment size, and then you don't have to think about it too much. Or you can say just invest in whatever Nancy Pelosi is investing in, right? Because she's notoriously good at gaming the fact that she's part of the House. And so I think you can imagine that into a future where you've got these predictive and analytical models, which you could give it a bit of flavor, like give it a stuff that you know about, right? So you say, talk whenever you think about a model that, whenever you want to make an investment in the area of biotechnology or computer science, come have a conversation with me. But if you want to make an investment outside that realm, just kind of do your own thing. You could crowdsource that intelligence perhaps, and then, ingest it and turn it into a strategy. You could even talk to such models and say, these are the things that I'm interested in. I want to invest in a green future. I want to invest in clean, energy tech. So construct your analytical model with that sort of secondary goal in mind. I think that's a no-brainer. The relationship between ML models and finance services is just so obvious. With the one caveat that you would have to find a way to keep arbitrage around, because if everyone's using the exact same predictive model, no one wins.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I think to dive into the problem a little bit more, like there's not banking infrastructure in a lot of different countries. And one of the things I was thinking about was the fact that one of my friends just went to Lebanon. So he's from there and he went back to the country to visit his family. And he noticed that a lot of people were hoarding USD and like just keeping it in cash and they weren't banking at all. And just the entire banking infrastructure was completely like turned on its head. I don't know if you remember, but like lira is one of the most devalued currencies in the world. Like it's just got pummeled over the last 5 years. There was a huge crisis happening and people don't trust the currency anymore. So one of the things I think about is predictive analytics around the currency, because a lot of people, like we don't have to think about currency as much because SGD, AUD, USD, there is times when the exchange rate matters and because you're between two countries and we also both have USD, like we're thinking about it a little bit. But in those countries, it's actually really important because it like devalues so quickly. So having predictive analytics around, okay, should I even hold this currency? Should I hold a different currency? That seems really interesting to me. And maybe just building up predictive analytics around different currencies in more poor countries where banking is not as sophisticated would be useful for those people.
That's a really good one. I think you could generalize it as well to black swan events in general, right? Like instead of trying to teach people or like provide analytical services that are like doing the day-to-day stuff, you just provide an analytical service that's saying this pattern is not a natural ebbing and flowing. Your currency is about to go to zero. Like leave, get into Bitcoin, whatever it is. Like I don't know. And because that would even be useful in the first world, right? Like just because I think for people like you and I, if we were invested in the S&P 500 before the pandemic, we're fine. Like you can hold through it. It doesn't matter, right? Like we don't need that money for 40 years. But if you were in your 60s or 70s and you're about to retire and suddenly the S&P 500 crashes by 40%, that's huge for you because you can't just sit on it for 10 years and wait for it to recover. Okay, it only took 5 years in this instance, but like that's still massive, right? For someone who's not working and saving actively and they're living off those savings. So being able to tell those people, hey, this looks bad, this looks real bad, just be the cautious thing. You don't need to maybe squeeze that extra 10% this year if the risk is losing half. Let's exit. I could see that being meaningful.
Yeah.
How do you do gasification on access to financial services?
Gasification. What was the other one? You remember?
Programmable matter.
Okay, programmable matter. Okay, I mean, my mind just goes to like programming my fingers to become my decentralized bank, and I just can pay for stuff using my fingers. I don't have to do anything, and the bank is just my body because
What?
Yeah, I'm a node in the blockchain, and that's it. Like I'm computing stuff, and then other humans are acting as like my validators, and like that's how I'm doing transactions. Like,
okay, so me and a buddy of mine came up with the most insane idea when we first came into biotech, which is that we first discovered programmable RNA and these things called riboswitches, which deserves a whole podcast in and of itself. But basically, people figured out that you could program basic logic gates using RNA. So the same sort of molecules that were being injected into you during, the pandemic for vaccines, you can actually program those things to interact with each other in such a way that, these two molecules will only interact if something is true. And that interaction will create a modified piece of RNA that can then plug into something else. And people were able to build like addition and like subtraction using RNA. So in principle, you could take this to the extreme because you also have like intercellular messaging agents, like these exosomes that you could use to send signals and sort of RNA payloads between cells. Like, could you create a cellular blockchain? Like, could you literally create a program that lives inside a person and survives long term? So you could take like private keys, for example, which you just can't lose because they are you. Like to lose them is to die. It's like a dead man switch for your private key. And that was one of the big challenges for access to financial services that the blockchain promised was like, okay, great, you don't need banks, but now you're trying to convince people who are not necessarily tech literate or to your point, don't have laptops, maybe don't have internet access. How are they going to manage a private key? Like that's probably even worse, to be honest. So yeah, put it in your body.
yes, and that we should also extend that to become a tontine. So a tontine is a system where, a bunch of people put in money. Let's say they're all 30 years old. And then, let's say we set an age of retirement at like 60, 65. after the age of 65, you get a payout every year. And as people die off, your payout increases or stays a bit longer. And so only the people that are alive still get a payout. I think current life insurance systems and superannuation and stuff like that, I don't know how they're going to survive with lifespan extensions. I think a lot of people aren't thinking about that. So yeah, we should do tontines with programmable matter
They'll be the opposite, right? They'll boom because they'll be reaping life insurance premiums and no one's going to be dying. They'll don't have to pay anyone out.
Oh yeah, that's a good point. I think it's more like the working age will have to be longer, whereas people expect to retire at 65. It's going to be a lot longer than that. So, and also we have an aging population. So that's the other factor there's not going to be any young people anymore to do work. So if the average age becomes 65 all of a sudden and no one's working anymore, that's basically what's happening in Japan. Like that's happening as we speak. I think the average age is like over 50 or something, or maybe 45. It's pretty high up.
How does that relate to access to financial services?
I don't know. I think the tontine thing is around the financial services, right?
Okay.
That is a financial product in some sense.
It was 49.5 years, by the way.
Yeah, there you go. It's 45 and 55, so it's kind of
That's pretty old.
Yeah, that's a big issue right now. One of the actual pitches I have for entry level is all the young people in Africa. So that's where we're going to be doing our work. And in 10 years, everyone's going to be coming at me for it's like, shit, we don't have any young people. We have to start doing immigration from Africa. Or get people to have babies. Those are the only two solutions that have to happen over the next 10 years. And so, I think reskilling people in more emerging markets where birth rates are much higher makes a lot of sense.
Mm-hmm.
You also have a lot of talented people there, super smart. They're all studying biochemistry and physics and really intense subjects, which is cool to see.
I would be curious how those educations stack up to a typical Western education, though. Can you take someone who's graduated from a biochemistry course in Africa and pit them against someone who's graduated from a biochemistry course at UNSW, and are they equally skillful? Because I think that's the real key, right? Is that, I haven't had this experience outside of I'm not as qualified to judge it outside of computer science, but certainly in computer science, there are people who have I've studied programming, and then you put them up against someone who's studied programming, and the gap between them is magnificently huge. And it, I think it's a lot of these online courses are part of that problem, right? Where you just get people, they do half a dozen online courses for learning how to program, and they think that they can go toe to toe with someone who's done a university degree in it. And at a good university, and the difference between learning how to program at a good university and a bad university is significant and noticeable very quickly.
Yeah, that makes sense. I don't have proof of this. It's just my observations. I think that their education tends to be a little bit more memorization based as opposed to experimental and more, here's an open-ended problem to solve. And so I think when they deal with problems that are a little bit more varied, they tend to struggle a little bit more. That's what I've seen from training people in different countries. And that's something we're trying to solve as well. We're trying to figure out how to introduce more varied projects, because they spend 10 years memorizing really hard equations and writing them down. Whereas I feel in other universities, you spend a little bit more time proving those equations, understanding why they occur the way they do, and then how do you apply them to varied situations. Yeah. But no proof there, so don't come at me for the stats. Anecdotally.
I think, yeah, anecdotally, I've seen the same thing, even just between Singapore and Australia, for example, where Australians are very well educated in being told, we've taught you 6 tools. Now here's a problem. Which tool are you going to use, right, to solve which combination of tools? Whereas people in Singapore are used to the question being framed as, here's a question and one of the tools that we've taught you, use that tool. And if you don't tell them which tool to use to solve the job, they struggle a lot more than if you were to tell them exactly how you want it done. So they're good soldiers. If you tell them this is the problem and this is the solution, they'll go do it and they'll go do a good job. But if you just give them the problem, they kind of come back to you, not literally, but with this attitude of, okay, but how do you want it solved? And you're well, part of the reason I hired you is because I want you to figure out how to solve it. not just to be the robot that solves it the way that I want it done.
Yeah, I totally agree. Cool. All right, that was a good session. I actually thought that was really fun. We should next time we have a guest, we should just play this game with a guest, and I think we'll just mine their brain for different ideas. Yeah. This is a good content. We'll just do this like once a month or something, depending if the audience likes it. But I think we could just bring different people, play the game, and just like brainstorm ideas. I think it'll be fun. Yeah.
I think, I mean, we got kind of unlucky there in the sense that we got 2 education ones.
And we got gasification twice too.
I was going to ask you, if you've played this game a bunch, like how often do the same technology, like how diverse is this deck?
I haven't played it that many times, but I haven't seen those combinations before.
Okay, fair enough.
Yeah. And then sometimes the technology is like really random, like it was like kites, and you're like, okay, how does kites apply to education?
I love that though. That's the point.
Yeah, that is the point. Yeah. Cool. All right. Good session. I'll catch you later. And I'll catch everyone else later too.